Once More with Feeling by Wetpretzel, read by LMX Marbella. Chapter 9. Pansy Parkinson was in her office, and Hermione felt a terrible sense of déjà vu. Again, not just in her office, but once more, lounging in Hermione's desk chair with another pair of stilettos that probably cost more than double Hermione's monthly wage, rhythmically tapping against the side of her desk. And what irritated Hermione the most was that Pansy had apparently discovered her biscuit drawer. Her face screwed up into a grimace as she glared in disgust at the half-bitten biscuit delicately held between her forefingers. "Remind me not to invite you along to the wedding menu tasting, Granger," Pansy drawled as she tossed the biscuit haphazardly onto Hermione's desk. "Your taste in food is atrocious." Hermione bristled at the dozen of crumbs that scattered across her paperwork. Great, great. Now she was going to have biscuit grease stains on official Wizarding records. She strode over to her desk and stared pointedly at her chair. "Miss Parkinson," she grinded out. Pansy just raised a perfectly sculpted brow at her in return, and her eyes glittered with mirth as she refused to move. Stilted silence stretched between the pair, a nonverbal sparring for the upper hand, and her chair. Pansy's cool but amused expression morphed into a smirk, and she leaned back into the seat with a satisfied, content hum, her nails rhythmically tapping on the plush armrest. Hermione huffed and turned to sit, rather aggressively, in her guest chair. In her own office. Hermione wondered if the laws of self-defense magic applied to intrusive snakes that had accosted her seat. Her hand itched towards her wand holster as she took great pleasure in imagining a flock of canaries chasing Pansy out of her office. Her lips twitched in restrained laughter. "What brings me the pleasure of your company, Parkinson?" Hermione aimed for cordial. It sounded withering. Pansy looked at her, bored, as if Hermione had been the one to intrude on her. "You know, contrary to what some people might think," Pansy threw Hermione a pointed look, "an errand of the Sacred 28 has quite a lot to do." "Oh, yes." Hermione bet deciding which set of ostentatious wizarding robes to wear for afternoon tea was quite strenuous. A cold lick of panic struck through her when Pansy's eyes narrowed into slits briefly, and she thought only for a moment that she had accidentally said it out loud. As far as Hermione could tell, Pansy must have just been able to read the sardonic look on her face instead, and Hermione let herself relax slightly into her chair. She sensed that this wasn't going to be a short visit. "From liaising with the wedding planner," hardly an important task, Hermione dispatched inwardly, "to attending elocution lessons, mastering the varieties of ballroom dancing, maintaining and upkeeping the blood wards of the family home, learning the delicate art of networking. Again, I would highly consider you looking into that one, Granger. Maybe you should also look into doing ballet. What is with that posture? Are you trying to look like a hag?" Hermione gritted her teeth and took to her old comfort of singing the Hogwarts school song in her head. It had certainly worked the last time. "Where was I? Oh, and of course, let's not forget learning how to manage the family finances." "Whether we be old and bold." "Wouldn't your father be in charge of your family's money? It wouldn't not." Hermione's brows knit together in a frown. "Yes, they like to believe that they do." Pansy smirked before she tittered with a mock disapproving shake of her head. "Surely you, of all people, would understand the notice of not letting a man be in charge of your finances, Granger. Yes, my father arranged my dowry, but I assure you it is the matriarch's duty to endeavour the longevity of our generational wealth. My mother has had me assist her in running the books since my monthlies began." Hermione gulped at Pansy's mention of a dowry. That was so archaic. Her eyes widened as a wicked voice inside her mind asked if the Malfoys would expect one from her. "Our heads could do with filling with some interesting stuff." Hermione observed Pansy for a moment, the relaxed yet inline positioning of her shoulders, the carefully crafted, cool indifference to her face, her perfectly manicured nails. It all, indeed, radiated fine grooming. Her great-grandmother Ida would have loved Pansy, she grimed. "With all of that being said, I'm sure it's clear to you now that I have very little spare time. You understand that feeling, Granger, right?" Pansy said wryly, and her eyes glittered knowingly before they hardened into a shrewd glare. "So, the fact that I've spent the last 3 days babysitting a lovesick, depressed Draco Malfoy on my family room chaise has hardly been very beneficial for me." Hermione had known from the moment that she saw Pansy's sleeked hair as she walked into her office that she was there but Draco. but the sound of his name made her jolt all the same. She hadn't seen a single strand of his hair since the day in her office, and there had been a dull, persistent ache in her heart at the idea that he was avoiding her. Avoiding her and licking his wounds at the Pansy Parkinson's family home, evidently. Hermione hoped that she didn't look as meek as she felt with her shoulders sunk inwards and her heart shriveled and cold in her chest. Was he really that miserable? A small voice in her head wondered how quickly she could apparate to the Parkinson's estate, and twitched towards her wand. "Is he okay?" she whispered instead, her eyes focused on a scuff mark on her desk.
"Sure,"
Pansy scoffed.
"he only went and had his heart stomped and pillaged by the love of his life, and now seems to be on some kind of shower strike. Greatly appreciated, Granger. It's not like he's stinking up a family antique or anything. Not to mention, he's drowning a bottle of 2-century-old fire whiskey like it's pepper a potion. But yeah, he's okay,"
she sneered. Hermione stared at her, horrified. "And you're just letting him. He could seriously hurt himself."
"I don't think you're in any position to be criticizing me about Draco's well-being right now, Granger,"
Pansy said icily. It was like ash in Hermione's mouth as the bitter truth of Pansy's words hit her. "Is this the part where you curse me in retribution? Have you forgotten the part where I had no idea Draco and I were in a relationship? I'm sure you and Nod have loafed about it plenty of times over the past year," Hermione snapped back.
"Do save the moral outrage for someone who actually cares, Granger."
Pansy examined her nails, her face blank with boredom.
"I'm sure Porter's glasses steam up with excitement every time he gets the opportunity to do a big inspirational speech. So you should save your breath. Besides—"
Pansy looked at her, her eyes dark and fixed like a viper.
"Was it really so awful finding out that you were dating him?"
Hermione swallowed nervously as she struggled to avoid staring at the spot on the floor where she'd cried into her assistant's shoulder for nearly an hour. The spot where Draco had confessed his love for her. The spot where Hermione admitted to herself that she loved him back. Her heart twisted in her chest. He never told me how he really felt." Pansy cut her off with an impatient wave.
"Yes, truly tragic. The emotionally repressed man couldn't just speak to his emotionally stunted girlfriend. We've all spent many a night weeping into our pillows over it,"
she drawled before her eyes narrowed shrewdly.
"But from what I've gathered, it's not like you would have given him a chance anyways."
Hermione flicked her tongue across her teeth in irritation. "And what's that supposed to mean?" she gritted out.
"Don't act dumb, Granger. We both know it's beneath you. Every time he invited you out for dinner, did you really think he just wanted to split some lobster with you?"
Pansy laughed scornfully. She sat upright in Hermione's chair and glared at Hermione with utter disdain.
"He is tried. I swear to Sassy he's tried, Granger. But you didn't want to hear it, did you? You just stuffed that ugly bushy hair of yours into your ears, lamenting about your poor defenseless house elves, and how could we forget about your psychotically deranged beasts that needed your precious help? Oh, but of course, the savage manticore who have slayed Alcans for centuries is so much more important than Draco's feelings."
Pansy rose from the chair and leaned her hands against the desk. Her eyes were lethal in their venom as she sneered down at Hermione.
"You were more than happy to use his body when you got all wound up, and I bet you just loved having your own personal chef to cook you your meals every week. You were all for getting a taste of what it meant to be Draco Malfoy's girlfriend, as long as it meant you didn't have to give him anything in return, right? Did you ever even once stop to consider his feeling in all of this?"
Pansy tilted her head to the side, a mockery of a pout on her lips as she pondered.
"Did you really not have any time, Granger? Or was that just an excuse, What? Big, brave Gryffindor princess couldn't handle the fact that disgraced Death-Eater Malfoy fancied her? Or was that some kind of petty revenge for the war?"
Anger boiled in Hermione's stomach, her spine straightened in defense. Pansy's eyes narrowed further, and she leaned in closely and practically hissed. "You got tortured by a psychotic aunt, whilst he just stood by and watched, and you decided a little payback was needed? Proof that the good-for-nothing bully has a heart after all, and then crush it in your stubby, ungroomed fingers?" Hermione snapped to her feet. Her hair bristled and sparked painfully against her neck. "How dare you!" Hermione seethed. "How dare you think even for 1 second that I would ever hold the action of his family against him? For Merlin's sake, we were all just kids. I don't give a ruddy ass about his past, Parkinson. He has proved to me more than enough times that he is not that cruel, vindictive boy from our school years. He's Hermione's nose burned, and she stubbornly blinked back the salty tears that threatened to fall. She couldn't tell if they were from a heartache or rage. "Draco Malfoy is one of the greatest wizards I've ever had the pleasure of knowing," she said vehemently. "He's brilliant, he's intelligent, he's so bloody charming it'll make your teeth rot. He's probably going to run against me for Minister of Magic one day, and damn it, I'm not sure he'd lose. Hermione exhaled heavily, her lips pressed tightly together to bite back a sob. He takes care of me in more ways than I can ever possibly count, and he's never once asked for anything in return. If it wasn't for him, I'd have probably fainted my way into a permanent bed in St. Mango's." And the acknowledgment of that hurt. If it wasn't for Draco intervening at the right time, what Ron and Harry said to her a few weeks ago was right. She was heading for a breakdown, whether she would have ever admitted that to herself or not. Her chest was hollow. Merlin, how could Hermione be so intelligent, yet so equally hopeless? Hermione shook her head, her eyes fixed on the floor as thick tears finally fell. "I did make excuses, but not because of him." She spat and she looked up, mustering up as much anger as she could to glare at Pansy. It was because of me." She swallowed miserably. "I'm not good enough for him. You're right. I didn't think about how he felt. I didn't let myself think about how he truly felt. I took all the attention I could get, as long as it didn't interfere with my work, and I couldn't give myself the opportunity to let my feelings for him grow. I was being selfish." "I'm a selfish man, Granger." Hermione's chest lurched in a weak laugh. Oh, how wrong Draco was. She had been the one to push away her feelings, refused to let her thoughts get carried away about him. She had, as Draco said, stuck her head in the sand, too afraid to face the truth in her heart. And yet she'd still eagerly tagged along on every adventure. She'd still lick up every crumb of the food he cooked for her. She'd basked under every touch, every kiss, every murmured sweet nothings against her skin. And then she had proceeded to act as if they were nothing more than desk buddies the next day. Granted, Draco would then carefully plot another evening, minced over his words so that he gave nothing away. And he had had literally hundreds of opportunities to come clean with her. Another part of her argued. Maybe they were both as selfish as each other. Draco's mirthful words, when they'd been reunited after his Billywood case, trickled into her mind, and just fluttered in bitter sweetness. What a pair they made, indeed. Hermione blinked out of her thoughts, and fixed her glare on Pansy. "So don't you dare come in here and insinuate that I think I'm too good for Draco when it's just the complete opposite." Time seemed to be endless, and Pansy stared at Hermione, and she had begun to wonder if Pansy had actually zoned out during Hermione's impassioned speech, when Pansy's face oozed into a knowing, triumphant smirk, and she stood up straight, her chin cocked towards the ceiling in sheer satisfaction. A pit fell from Hermione's stomach when she realized that she might have just fallen into Pansy's trap, that she had given Pansy exactly what she wanted. "You love him!" It wasn't a question. Hermione felt all of the blood drained from her face, her heart ferocious pounding against her ribcage as she stammered. "You love him!" Pansy interrupted her pathetic quivering. "And for whatever reason, instead of pulling up your granny knickers and dealing with it like any normal witch, you hid behind your stacks of paperwork." A manicured nail flicked at a mountain of files that were perched dangerously close to the edge of the desk, and her voice lowered, her earlier venom trickling back in. "As long as you had your pathetic little creatures, you were safe, right? You could remain in blissful ignorance and have your little work husband without having to face any of the ugly consequences of your actions." What consequences? "You don't even realize just how far gone Draco is for you, do you?" Pansy cut her off, and her pupils flared hotly. "All you'd have to do is toss that hideous, unkempt plate of yours over your shoulder and bet your big muggle-born doe eyes at him, and he'd come running to pant at your feet, ready to lick up any drop of measly attention you could be bothered to give." Pansy was positively bursting with rage. Her usually poised demeanor all but forgotten. Yet Hermione could still detect the faintest layer of pain and distraught in her face, and it hit her that for as long as Draco had been withholding his feelings for her, Pansy must have been holding back a year's worth of anger and pain for her dear friend. Hermione couldn't help but picture every business dinner, every time she sat with Draco's arm on the back of her chair, every time he leaned in to murmur some sly quip about his friends in her ear, and Hermione would try in vain not to tremble in arousal as his hot breath licked down her neck. Every time she and Draco argued over whose turn it was to pay the bill, whilst the other couple sat there smirking at their antiques. Had Pansy really been filled with silent loathing towards her, biting her tongue every time? Hermione already knew that Pansy didn't like her. That was obvious enough, a sentiment that was wholeheartedly returned. But the fact that Pansy had to sit back and watch as her friend and ex-boyfriend made himself suffer for over a year made Hermione's stomach twist with acidic guilt and pity. Pansy was still raging.
Every dinner rejection, every time you tossed him back through the flue, once we're done using him like one of your filthy little muggle toys. Draco still gave and gave with no regards to his own mental state. All of those precious little private museum tours. Do you even know how much those cost him? Playing healer for you, slaving away like a bloody house elf week after week so that you don't faint at your desk because apparently the only other food worthy of touching Granger's lips are some nasty little stale biscuits. Draco's beyond in love with you, Merlin knows why, and he's so stupidly in love that he won't stop to consider just how unhealthy this is for him. Do you even know how many times Theo and I have pleaded, have begged for him to just quit his job? Just to get away from you?
Pansy rounded the desk, her expression so cold it made the hackles on the back of Hermione's neck rise.
You're as poisonous as those rotten biscuits of yours, Granger.
Her voice was deathly quiet.
So yes, you're quite right. You don't deserve him. In fact, it wouldn't be so much as a blimp in my day if you were to go full Janus Thickney from your job and spend the rest of your life drooling into your pumpkin juice. But Draco would be devastated, and frankly, like I said earlier, I don't have the time to be stitching him back together.
Pansy leaned in, a hand coming up to tuck a stray curl behind Hermione's ears. A spiteful nail scratched rather painfully against the delicate skin, the nasty cow, as she murmured,
"So pull that broomstick out of your surprisingly pert ass, push that bushy hair out of your eyes, and try to see things from Draco's perspective."
With a light, cordial smile that clashed terribly with the warning iciness of her eyes, Pansy flicked her brows up and wriggled her fingers in goodbye. Hermione wondered how much restraint it took for Pansy to not barge into her shoulders as she breezily headed towards the door.
"Oh, and Granger!"
And really, couldn't these Slytherins ever leave a room without a final dramatic word? Hermione bit back a huff and turned on her heel to toss her a glare. The faintest hint of amusement danced in Pansy's eyes before her expression cooled once more.
"I hear that Lady Malfoy has thought to deal with your party robes personally. Make no mistake about it, Granger. Even if it means me imperioing you, I will be seeing that outfit at my engagement party."
With a final smirk and wink, Pansy disappeared behind a door frame and left Hermione to wonder what the odds were of her being able to install blood wards around her office. A Tupperware box appeared on her desk around lunchtime, whilst Hermione was sluggishly working her way through her documents. She stared at it, her eyes burning as salty tears swarmed her vision. There was no note. He always left a note. Hermione's chest ruptured. He clearly didn't even want to speak to her anymore. Her quill and paperwork forgotten, Hermione's head sank into her hands, and she sobbed. She cried until the steam had long faded, and she could no longer feel the warmth from the container. Draco still hadn't returned to the department, and her mind had poisoned her over and over again with the image of the tortured, heart-splitting pain of his eyes that day he walked out of her office, out of her life. Hermione had never felt more miserable in her entire existence. She had tried to find the courage to owl him night after night, and yet every time she was about to tie the letter to the postal old's leg, Pansy's acidic words would screech in her mind. Hermione was poisonous for him. And the more she reflected on Pansy's words, the more she couldn't help but wonder if she was right. Hermione was stubborn. She had cowered away from her feelings, and she was so work-focused she barely even managed more than half a night's sleep. How could she so selfishly expect Draco to put up with that for the rest of his life? No, she wouldn't let him. And so she would let the owl angrily nip at her fingers from another wasted journey, and she would spend as much of the night as she could until her head was about to snap off from her neck in exhaustion, buried neck-deep into her case files as a small voice in the back of her mind pleaded with her to stop punishing herself. Hermione never listened, but her body quickly began to wear down. No longer fueled by her self-deprecating rage like a couple of weeks ago, it had been an exceedingly difficult couple of days for her as she worked through the endless ocean of paperwork, and Hermione was just exhausted. And it was showing in her work. She'd made spelling errors, forgotten to send old cases back to the archives, had missed a follow-up meeting with Mr. Wilk, who, judging me by the foul howler waiting for her on her desk the next morning, was none too happy about that. And I'd included the wrong hearing request with the appropriate case, so now 2 cases had to be backlogged while she started the finding motion all over again. And Hermione couldn't even bring herself to care. At that realization, her spine went tight, her blood cold. Her head slowly lifted from her hands, and she blinked. It was like her eyes were the clearest they had been in a long time, as she took in the hundreds of pieces of paper, the dozen or so unopened manila folders, and the sticky memo notes that bordered the edges of her desk. Her neck throbbed. There had been a sharp pinch under her left shoulder blade for days now. A glance to the mirror next to the desk showed her bloodshot, bruised eyes. Her skin was alarmingly sallow, and her right hand had a tremor from how tightly she had been clenching her quill. If Hermione couldn't feel the shuddering of her own pulsing heartbeat, she'd have assumed that she was close to death. Her eyes stung with tears again as she gasped at her appearance. What was she doing to herself? Had she let herself slip so far down that she didn't even care about her job anymore? Her chest clenched painfully when she realized how she had felt more irritated and concerned by these creatures the past couple of days. Her throat closed off, guilt and shame suffocating her. Harry and Ron were right. She was going to ruin herself. Merlin had really only taken just a few weeks without him being there for her to fall back into her old toxic habits. She needed to get out of there. She needed a break. She looked back at her desk, her stomach twisting with nausea as she took in all of the untouched paperwork again. Shaking her head in fear and disgust and denial, she couldn't quite tell. She pushed her chair back from her desk, and her knees trembled as she stood and headed towards her door. "Laura, I apologize for the sudden notice, but I'm taking some time off," Hermione announced to the apparent shock of her assistant. Madly blinked rapidly, and Hermione could practically see her brain whirring away as she tried to process what she had said.
You're as in, you're not going to be here?"
Madly gulped at her. Hermione nodded, and she was surprised at just how comforting and relieving it felt to say those words. "Yes, I think I need a break." She smiled apologetically at her assistant. "Can you rearrange my meetings? I don't think I'll be in for the rest of the week." She could have sworn Madly actually sagged in relief, and her assistant nodded enthusiastically.
"Yes, I'll do that right away, Miss Granger."
She reached for her quill and inkpot, already scrawling away. Before she looked back up, a genuine, happy smile on her face.
"Enjoy the rest of your week, Miss Granger. You've more than earned it."
As it turned out, taking a few days off from work wasn't as daunting as Hermione had feared it would be. The bruising from underneath her eyes had faded, and she no longer looked a breath's distance away from death. Of course, there was still that annoying entity in the back of her mind that cruelly whispered about the mounds of cases on her desk, the dozens of creatures that were waiting to hear back from her, that she was being selfish and sloppy. But by the morning of the second day, the voice had already begun to quiet, and there was a relaxed ease to her shoulders that Hermione hadn't felt in some time. And if she kept herself busy with household chores that she had been putting off for weeks, it was easy to ignore the slight anxious clench of her chest that appeared whenever she found herself imagining being sat at her desk in her empty, hydrangealess office. The moon was high in the sky by the time Hermione had all but completed her chores for the day, and was sorting away her freshly washed clothes into her drawers. Hermione bent down and opened up the third drawer, her back stiff from standing up for so long, and her bones groaned in protest, to put away her dark blouses when she paused, her eyes going wide. One of Draco's cashmere jumpers lay folded up neatly to the side. Hermione exhaled heavily, a trembling hand reaching to stroke the buttery soft fabric. Apples and cedarwood reached her nostrils, and her eyes widened. Her hand delicately pulled the jumper from its place and brought it to her face. She breathed in the scent of his cologne, and it was like Hermione was floating in a peaceful, still lake. Her head grew hazy and full, her limbs heavy as she clumsily pulled the fabric over her head. Every fibre of her body melted in comfort, and she curled her arms tight across her waist. With his scent around her, she could almost pretend it was his arms she was wrapped up in. With her abandoned washing basket nudged to the side, Hermione headed for her bed. With her chin tucked into her chest and her hands curled into the sleeves of Draco's jumper, Hermione was out before her head met the pillow. It was the best night's sleep she had had in weeks. "Do you think I overreacted with Draco?" Hermione asked once Gínny had safely maneuvered her pregnant belly into the dining room chair. Free from the taunting mountains of paperwork, Hermione had finally let herself sit down and reflect over the last couple of weeks. Her flat was too large and too empty of life for her now, and she couldn't help but wonder who she had been silently punishing more, Draco or herself. Eventually her thoughts had begun to overwhelm her, and she'd rather spontaneously invited herself to the Potter's house for an afternoon of some much-needed, furless and human company. "Yes," Harry said, his lip pursed over the rim of his teacup. "Gee, think a little quicker, would you, Harry?" Hermione said dryly. In a rather pantomime pause, Harry's eyes squinted in faint consideration. Yes. "I liked you better when you lived in a cupboard, Potter," Hermione grumbled and crossed her arms together, sulkily. Harry and Ginny both snorted.
Hermione, just can you explain to me again exactly why you were so mad?
Ginny frowned at her and raised a hand to count on her fingers.
I mean, you fancied him. You willingly spent time with him outside of work, and you shagged and brought him every chance you got.
Harry gagged, his ears flushing when the pair rolled their eyes at him, and turned to watch his son duel his teddy bears with a stick that James had found in their garden. "He never told me that they were dates," Hermione sighed, feeling like a broken record. And yet, each time she had to explain herself, even she could tell that her excuses had grown weak, and Hermione had grown irritated with her own stubborn self. Her explanations drained her, like it used up more energy to give an excuse than to just simply admit how she felt. Her heaving sobs on the floor of her office flashed in her mind, and Hermione paused to take a sip of her drink, and was very grateful for the way that Harry and Ginny artfully ignored her hand that trembled against the handle. "Why is it so hard for everyone to believe that I thought it was just a night out with a colleague? Is it really so absurd a thought?"
Yes, because I too regularly visit museums after hours in exclusive tours, and then canoodle with my co-worker in the changing rooms,
Harry quipped, and bit back a snicker when Hermione flushed. Ginny turned to look at her husband with an impish grin.
Which co-worker? Is it Sergeant Morgan? He's rather dishy.
She smirked at the way that Harry paled, his eyes narrowing in a light scowl behind the thick rims of his glasses.
"Remind me not to bring you to the Christmas office party this year,"
Harry said, and returned Ginny's gesture when she playfully stuck out her tongue at him. Hermione smiled, observing the pair. They truly were good together, good for each other, like how Draco was for her. Pansy's venomous words from that fateful day in her office hissed in her ear, and her smile dropped away as quickly as it had appeared. Hermione thumped the rim of her cup, the pit in her stomach hollow and achy. "Parkinson said I'm poisonous for him," she whispered, and her bottom lip trembled. Harry frowned and shook his head, a shocking mess of dark hair falling into his eyes. "That's a bit harsh, not to mention untrue and unfair." Harry reached over to squeeze her hand in comfort.
"Malfoy told you. He knew what he was doing. He's a grown man, Hermione. He could have clued you in any time, but he didn't. Parkinson, that wasn't fair of her to put the blame on you. And since when do you give a crap about what Parkinson thinks about you?"
Harry stared at her, aghast.
"Parkinson doesn't know you like we do,"
Ginny chimed in.
"She only can see things from his side. She's probably just being overprotective. Besides, how many friends actually like their friends' partners? She probably just doesn't think anyone's good enough for him. Slytherins, you know, they have some intense, deep-seated sense of loyalty for their own."
Ginny shrugged and looked at Hermione with a warm smile.
"Don't let her get to you. It's probably what she wants."
"Okay, but do you think I was stringing him along? I mean, did it seem like I was using him?" Hermione looked at them both imploringly, her shoulders drooping when they both shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Be honest." Harry scratched behind his ear and smiled weakly at her.
"It's not that simple, Hermione. It's a weird situation you were in, you know. There was bound to be some imbalances between you two. I'm not saying that you did it on purpose,"
he added quickly when he saw how her face sunk, collapsing against the back of her seat defeatedly.
No, we know you, Hermione. You care so deeply for people. How could we ever think that you would intentionally do something like that to him?"
He fiddled with his glasses, a hand brushing away his messy hair.
"I mean, do you want us to sit here and blame you for not pulling your weight in a relationship that you didn't even know you were in? Come on, Hermione, that's mental." "Like I said, Hermione, Pansy doesn't know you like we do," Ginny began carefully. "And I do agree with Harry, but Hermione, but Hermione, did you really not once think about how Malfoy felt about your situation?
Hermione shook her head, ashamed. Gods, how could I have been so selfish? She said, her voice thick with guilt, and she stared into her teacup. It felt like a pile of bricks was pressing down on her spine, suffocating her, and she inhaled a pained, sharp breath. Thick, salty tears burned her eyes as they cascaded down her cheeks.
Denial is one hell of a weapon, Hermione. Don't be so harsh on yourself,
Gínny said, with a comforting pat to her shoulder. Hermione's eyes clenched tightly, and her mind raced to change the topic. I've taken some time off work, she said, and straightened up, and wiping away at her tears aggressively. Harry and Gínny both blinked at her in surprise, and Hermione chuckled at a deep, scrutinizing scanning of Harry's eyes, like he had a sudden thought that she was someone else in a Polyjuice disguise. Ever the paranoid aura. Alistair Moody would have been so proud. Harry relaxed after a few moments and shrugged.
That would explain why you're here sans ministry files on a Thursday afternoon.
He looked at her in concern.
Hermione, it's not, you haven't, it's voluntary leave, right?
Many witches in lime green robes flashed in her mind, and her nails dug into her palms to hold back a shudder. She nodded vigorously and sent him a reassuring smile. Yes, I kind of had this thought that I may not exactly manage my time well, she finished lamely. Harry blinked.
And the bezoar is a universal poison antidote,
he said dryly, after a beat, and winked at her when she sent him a playful glare. She huffed out a laugh before swallowing bitterly. I don't even know how it happened. How did I even let it get so bad? She whispered, annoyance creeping through her, when she felt her eyes burn with tears again. Hermione shook her head. I thought the more cases I took on, the more control I had. The more cases I could focus on, then. I don't know what I thought. She had never felt more lost.
Why do you find it so hard to take a break, Hermione?
Gínny asked quietly. Hermione just shrugged. Her eyes burned into the lace pattern of the tablecloth. Silence fell over the trio for a few moments, broken only occasionally by James' gargled incantations and yells as he dueled his inanimate teddies. As always, Harry began and paused to clear his throat. It's mandatory for us to have a monthly counseling session with a mind healer. We're surrounded by dark magic and wizards every day, you know, and every 6 months we have to take enforced leave for 2 weeks. We're not even allowed to do desk work, or we get sanctioned by robots. Well, Hermione would have bloody hoped so. She had witnessed firsthand just how draining some of those cases had been on Harry and Ron. Every 6 months was outrageous. If it were up to Hermione, they'd be placed on leave every 12 weeks. She frowned at him, as she wondered why Harry had brought it up.
I know you're not dealing with any dark wizards day in, day out, but, Hermione, have you ever noticed? We were on the run for a year during the war, and then, when it ended, you went straight back to Hogwarts. I know you wanted to do your notes. Harry held up his hand when Hermione opened her mouth to rebut. But you finished your exams, and then you flew straight to Australia, and spent 8 months with healers to fix your parents' memories. And then you came back home, and immediately joined your department. Merlin, Hermione, when was the last time you actually willingly took a break that was longer than a weekend? Her cheeks prickled in shame when she realized that she couldn't name a single occasion. Harry smiled at her with pity. I think it might be worth you speaking with our department's mind healer. I think you need some help, Hermione. I think you might have, I don't know what, but you should really speak to someone. I'll send an owl if you'd like, he asked, gently. Draco helps me, Hermione whispered meekly. And that's great, Hermione,
Gínny nodded.
Really it is, but you know deep down that you can't keep relying on someone else to step in at the right moment and force you to stop when you need to. You need to want to stop on your own. I think you owe it to yourself to at least try after all these years.
Gínny was right, and it was like boulders of shame pushing down on her chest. Hermione had grown too dependent on him. He'd slithered into her life effortlessly, and Hermione had let herself get comfortable in the routine of it all. She'd let herself become reliant on Draco, and now that she no longer had the external stability, she'd become lost. She'd lost herself. A small voice in the back of her mind reminded her that she'd been lost to her bad habits long before Draco came into her life, and her eyes pinched shut, scarring memories of lime-green robes and her desperate pleading swarming around her mind. Maybe Harry was right. Maybe she did need to speak to someone. How could she have lost so much control?
Do you think that's why you can't let yourself commit to a relationship?
Gínny interrupted her miserable musings, chewing on her bottom lip. Her brows married in a frown as she looked at Hermione in contemplation.
Do you believe it's somehow a waste of your time?
Hermione thought back to her conversation with Pansy and shook her head. No, it's not like that. Draco, he's just so wonderful. Even before we, for the first time. He was just brilliant. He's the best colleague I've ever had. He just made everything effortless. She paused to smile sadly at Harry, who frowned at her, his eyes dark with guilt. It's like you said, Harry. I'm a mess when I'm stressed. And I know my job is stressful, but I love it. I love my job. I love the red tape and the challenging precedent and the legislation. I love dealing with temperamental creatures because I know it's the first time that they're feeling like they're actually being heard, and I want to do the best that I can for them. And if that means I can't go on romantic holidays or spontaneous visits to an exhibition, then there's a sacrifice I'm willing to make. At least she used to be, she tacked on internally. The scent of the Aegean Sea and Draco's cologne as she danced in his arms wafted through her mind, her own voice pleading with her to stay in that moment forever. The memory of Draco arm-wrestling her cat for a meagre slice of toast, the softness of his lips against hers as she kissed away his sulky pout. Her breakfast was so dull now. Draco deserves better than me, Hermione said, her head bowed in resignation.
He seems pretty happy to me, Hermione,
Gínny rebutted with a quirk of her brow.
The man said he loves you, for Merlin's sake. You must have done something right.
Harry nodded.
Hermione, weren't you upset with him because you felt like he had taken your choices away from you?
He pressed his lips together when Hermione shrugged half-heartedly. She didn't even know if she believed that anymore.
By deciding that you were not enough for him, aren't you taking away the choice from him too?
Harry continued.
Shouldn't that be something that he decides for himself? Are you just not doing the exact same thing to him now?
Shame clouded over her head. He had a point. She wondered if the universe was laughing at her over his twisted irony.
Hermione, for bugger's sake,
Gínny huffed as she tried to lean forward, her pregnant belly obstructing her path. She shot her husband a side glare.
Good luck trying to do this to me a third time, Potter.
A watery laugh left Hermione's chest as Harry coughed and pointedly looked away from the pair, his ears flushed as deep fuchsia as his cheeks. Gínny tossed her a quick wink before her face relaxed, her warm eyes compassionate yet firm.
Hermione, do you admit, his deception aside, how happy you've been this past year?
Gínny asked, and nodded alongside Hermione.
Then surely that's what you should be focusing on. Look, just forget about how hurt you were for a minute, as justifiable as you were in that regard. But how do you feel about him, truly?
Her heart trembled in her chest, and she looked down at the tablecloth again. But all she could see was Draco's private smile. Her chest quivered on a shaky inhale. I love him, she confessed. Gínny let out an excited gasp from somewhere above her head, her hand shooting out to squeeze Hermione's. Hermione, look at me. Harry's voice was steady and soothing. She did so, and a wave of comfort washed over her at the knowing glint of his eyes, his lips lopsided in a fond, exacerbated smile. With all due respect, if you love him, why the hell are you sat here at our kitchen table? Malfoy Manor was as grandiose as it was imposing. The tall, ivy-wrapped gates stood before a long gravelled path. Lush, freshly groomed hedges mirrored each side, leading up to the marbled steps of the entrance some 100 yards away from where Hermione stood. Hermione shifted on each foot, her bottom lip sore and swollen with the abuse from her teeth, as she stewed over her thoughts. What was she doing here? Would he even want to see her? Hermione hadn't outright rejected him that day in her office, but who was to say that he hadn't interpreted her unwilling silence as a way of letting him down gently? How many rejections could one wizard take before he had enough? After all, he had spent the last couple of days at Pansy's place, and it was grimly clear to Hermione how they thought of her over there. What if Pansy had told him what she told Hermione? That Hermione, indeed, wasn't good enough for him. That she was selfish and often one-track minded when she got stuck into one of her case files. What if Pansy warmed down and Draco agreed that Hermione wasn't worth it? That she wasn't worthy of him? She loved Draco truly. She loved him with every fibre of her being, and it was like every nerve was on fire from his touch, from just one look from him. And it apparently loved her too, through every little late night at her desk, every battle with her cat, every time she had pulled away from him, resetting the mockery of a boundary that she called a professional relationship. And yet, even though she loved him back, she had still broken his heart. She didn't deserve him. Pansy told her to look at the things from Draco's perspective, and she had. When he had asked her out on 3 separate occasions, she had rejected him. When she discovered the truth, she had kicked him out of her flat and ignored him for 3 weeks. When he told her he loved her, she hadn't been able to say back. Merlin, what was she doing here? She thought again. She cursed Harry and Gínny for convincing her to go to him. Surely he wouldn't still want her after she'd all but thrown his feelings in his face, and it wasn't like he would never be able to move on from her, Pansy's dramatic claims aside. He'd marry his beautiful, pure-blood wife and live in their beautiful yet terrifying manor, and Hermione would spend the rest of her life exhausted and miserable in her stupid, lonely office. A pop from behind her jolted Hermione out of her thoughts. She spun around eagerly, all of her anxieties and self-deprecating musings from just a moment ago quickly forgotten. Just 3 important words ready to spill from her mouth. To apologize for her stubbornness, her denial, her fear. To tell him just how much she wanted to be with him. To see a small female house elf stood curiously, yet proudly in front of her. She tried not to let the crushing disappointment show on her face as she smiled politely at the creature. Hello, my name is Hermione Granger, and you are?
We is Twinkle, Miss Granger.
Twinkle bowed deeply, her white bugged eyes shining with delight.
It is an honour to finally meet ye, Miss Granger. We is hearing so much about you from the young master, Miss Granger.
Master Malfoy talks about me? Hermione asked with a thick swallow, her tongue suddenly too large for her mouth, as if she'd been spiked with a tom-tongue toffee. Twinkle nodded enthusiastically, and her bat-winged ears slapped against her cheeks in a way that surely must have been bothersome, but her face betrayed no such emotion. Only sheer wonder and delight. Hermione would have even said that the elf looked awestruck, and she shifted on her feet in slight discomfort and embarrassment.
Oh, yes, Master Malfoy is saying many wonderful things about Miss Granger.
Twinkle frowned suddenly, and her fingers toyed nervously with the hem of her surprisingly tailored dress apron.
Oh, he is terribly sorry, miss, but the young master is not at home at this moment.
What? Hermione's spine was tight with disappointment. Surely he wasn't still at the Parkinson estate. Hermione could only imagine the variety of blood curses that would be cast upon her if she so much as dropped a hair onto Pansy's grounds.
He is most terribly sorry, Miss Granger. He is not knowing when he will be back. He is deeply wronged for Miss Granger's wasted journey.
Twinkle's nose practically touched the floor from her deep apologetic bow, and Hermione hurried to crouch in front of her. No, no, oh, please don't apologize. Hermione laid a gentle hand on the elf's bony shoulder. Really, I never notified the family of my visit. I'm rather intruding, to be honest. Do you know where he is?
Master Malfoy has been summoned to Cumbria for work, is all we is knowing, miss.
Hermione frowned. He didn't tell me. She cut herself off with a blush at her foolishness. Twinkle's eyes glazed over for a moment before they refocused and beamed blindingly at her.
The lady of the manor is requesting your presence, Miss Granger.
The little elf practically bounced in delight at that order, and Hermione blanched, panic positively wet against her spine, and awkwardly scrambled to her feet. Her knees pinched in sharp protest at the sudden movement, and Hermione groaned. No, really, it's okay, Hermione began before long, alarmingly thin fingers gripped around her wrist in shocking strength, and she felt a telltale pull of her navel as the ground vanished from beneath her feet, as the elf apparated them through the walls. She was in a conservatory, was the first thing that Hermione noticed, and her muscles oozed in relief. She didn't think she was prepared enough to step foot back into that drawing room. It was rather grand. She reckoned every square foot of her family home could have fit into this one room alone, and seemed to resemble that of an arboretum more than a conservatory. The gentle trickling of a nearby indoor lily pond and the bright leaves of the spirea bushes added a soothing layer of comfort to the layout of the room. A peculiar-looking plant caught her eyes. the vertical stripes of its sleeve seemingly dancing under her gaze. Hermione barely noticed her feet moving closer to the plant, her head growing fuzzy as her hand inched closer. "I wouldn't get so close if I were you." Like being doused with cold water, Hermione leapt backwards, and her head throbbed with a jarring sudden clarity at how close she had gotten to the plant, which, now that she could think clearly, had hundreds of sharp, slick teeth around its thin, pointed stalk. She whipped around at the sound of the amused voice, and paled at the sight of Narcissa Malfoy, sat only a couple of feet away, at an antique white iron garden table. Narcissa's lips twitched, and a perfectly poised brow raised at her questioningly. Hermione realized with belated mortification that she had curtsied at the sight of the matriarch. Rhizomea consanguineum, also known as Himalayan cobra lily, Hermione finished, and made the wise decision to step out of the plant's enchantment range. A flicker of surprise blinked across Narcissa's face, and Hermione's chest puffed out in slight pride at the thought that she might have just impressed her. Narcissa's lips pursed in contemplation as she looked up at her thoughtfully. "You've studied the art of botany, Miss Granger?" "Hermione, please, and, yes. As a part of my notes, it helped with herbology and potions, I found." "Helps indeed." Narcissa's voice twinkled, and she gestured for the seat opposite her. "Please join me, Miss Granger." Hermione said, and blushed when Henny knocked against the table. The delicate fine china rattled dangerously on the tabletop, and she looked at Narcissa sheepishly, the color of her cheeks deepening at the startled yet amused glint in Narcissa's eyes. Once settled, and she had waited for the unnerving rattling of the teacups to stop, Hermione looked back over at the plant and frowned. "Forgive me, Miss Malfoy, but I thought the plant's hypnotism charms were only effective if the plant had bloomed in the soil under the Himalayan mountains. I mean, that's why it's safe for them to be in the Muggle laboratories. The soil is protected under both magical and Muggle conservation laws, so they should be harmless." "Correct again, Miss Granger. But the law only came into effect 3 decades ago, and the Malfoy family has been in possession of the plant long before then. Under the right care, the cobra lily can live for up to 2 centuries. I believe Madame Windsor over there is still a sprightly young 75, Narcissa grinned wryly, and I'm told by the gardener that her venom doesn't feel a day over 50. Great Circe! A genuine, fully bloomed Himalayan cobra lily was plotted not 10 feet away from her, and she'd already almost been poisoned by it. Her insides practically vibrated with giddiness, and Hermione could only hope that she wasn't drooling with the academic possibilities of it all. Her reason for being there struck Hermione like a brick, and she dipped her head timidly, abashed that she had let herself get distracted and forgotten her manners. Oh, how her great-grandmother would color Hermione's buttocks at her cheek. "I apologize for the sudden intrusion, Mrs. Malfoy. I know I should have notified Draco earlier." "Yes, well, given the number of times that my son has snuck out of family dinners to spend the evening in more pleasurable company, it was only a matter of time before he tried to sneak you under my roof." Narcissa's lip curved into a smirk around the rim of her teacup. Hermione's stomach swooped in mortification, and her ears burned hotly. No, that's not. I wasn't here to. We're not," she stammered, her head shaking furiously. "I'm only teasing you, Miss Granger. I'm aware that you and my son are going through a rough patch," Narcissa said, and her brow slowly raised conspiratorially. "All too convenient that Draco was called away to the opposite end of the country in a work emergency. Would you not agree?" So Draco was avoiding her, she thought, and her shoulders bowed inwards, her heart seized and killed. Clearly sensing her mood shift, Narcissa tactfully asked about the goblin case that she was working on. Hermione blinked, briefly whiplashed at the sudden topic change, but eagerly went on to inform Narcissa of her progress for the next several minutes. I'm actually taking some time off right now," Hermione confessed afterwards, tucking a wayward curl behind her ear. "But when I go back, I'll be submitting the request for an official hearing date." "I do believe a dear old friend of mine works in that New Zealand bank, Miss Granger. I can write to him to request a witness statement if you think that will help your case," Narcissa offered. Hermione gulped before nodding enthusiastically. "Oh, that would be wonderful! Thank you, Mrs. Malfoy. If it's not too much trouble. I don't want to impose," she said, backtracking quickly, and her neck prickled hotly. Narcissa waved airily. It would be my pleasure, Miss Granger. Comfortable silence fell between the pair. The gentle trickling of the lily pond danced around the walls of the conservatory. Hermione waited for Narcissa to finish her sip of her drink before she spoke again. "Mrs. Malfoy, when you visited my office last month," she began, and her tongue flicked out to lick her lip nervously, "you told me how Draco once came to you to ask her to cheer me up." Hermione fiddled with her fingers in her lap. The calm indifference of Narcissa's face did not blink, and she nodded once. "I did." Hermione bit her lip and focused her eyes on a collection of oncidium orchids plotted just behind Narcissa. Why would he? What would you really like to know, Miss Granger? Hermione's eyes shot back to Narcissa's, and she pulled back her shoulder determinedly. How long has Draco been in love with me? How long had he been suffering in silence, waiting for the day that Hermione could possibly return his feelings? Waiting for Hermione to get over herself? Narcissa paused and observed her for a moment, with the faintest, scrutinizing tightness to her eyes. Hermione thought back to the suspicion in her office about Narcissa being a Legolemens, and she let the thought project clearly in her mind. I love him. Once more Narcissa's expression did not change, but her shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly, and the intensity of her gaze softened. Hermione could have sworn she saw another flicker of impressed surprise in her eyes for a brief moment. I do not wish to burden you with that knowledge, Miss Granger, Narcissa said carefully, before she glanced at her pointedly. And in any case, that is for my son to tell you, not myself. Hermione felt rightfully chastised. Her cheeks pinched warm with embarrassment. Goodness, how many more times would she put her foot in her mouth in front of Draco's mother? Right, I know, I'm sorry. I don't know what I'm doing, Hermione confessed. I know I need to make things right with him, but I don't know how. I guess what I'm really asking is, well, how do you, what is it that you... Her blush deepened, and she fiddled with her napkin, her lingering mortification making it impossible for her to ask. You are curious as how to we Malfoy women cheer up our man? Narcissa's grin was positively shark-like, and Hermione's skin tingled at Narcissa's inclusive use of the word our. Narcissa's eyes twinkled with a lecherous leer as she hummed thoughtfully. Well, I'm sure that Draco would appreciate not knowing the methods in which I use on his father. Hermione fervently hoped that the thick vines on the wall behind her belonged to the Devil's Snare family. She had had a good life, all things considered. She supposed she could be very content to die from suffocation in that moment. Narcissa smiled at her, all amusement fading away, whilst a delicate finger traced the rim of her china teacup. Relationships are as delicately unique as flowers, Miss Granger. No two bloom the same, nor hold the same level of beauty, but that beauty is subjective. Madame Windsor, for example, Narcissa gestured lightly. She is a personal favourite of mine, and Draco's too. But my husband much prefers the more obvious grace of the dahlia. In fact, there are many a wizard or witch who would rather not have to deal with the stubbornness and temperamental attitude of the cobra lily. But that does not mean the flower isn't worthy of respect, nor should it be denied the opportunity to bloom into its true potential. Hermione swallowed under Narcissa's pointed gaze, her ears warm. Narcissa continued. The beauty of a relationship is that it is intrinsically ours. How it blooms is entirely unique to our own circumstances. And whilst others may have their opinions and criticisms of its journey, Pansy's scathing glare flicked through Hermione's mind, and she wondered if Narcissa had also been informed of his friend's concerns. It is still your journey to take. It is up to you to discover what makes your relationship different to that of the dahlia, and therefore how it must bloom. Narcissa took a sip of her drink, as Hermione pondered over what she said. You said Mr. Malfoy prefers dahlias, Mrs. Malfoy? Hermione chewed on her lips, her stomach twisting with bitter nerves. Does he not approve of Draco and I? Not that she gave a damn what Lucius Malfoy thought about her, but he was still Draco's father at the end of the day, and Hermione did not wish to be the one to come between the family. Narcissa took a few moments to straighten her teacup on its saucer, before replying carefully, I would be lying to you, Miss Granger, if Lucius and I did not wish for you to come from a more Finer breeding. Hermione swallowed bitterly, and she looked away, watching the miniature trickling waterfall of the lily pond. She had known, of course, but hearing it fall from Narcissa's mouth still made her chest pinch tightly, all the same. A soft, gentle hand rested on top of hers, and Hermione drew her attention back to Narcissa. However, my son has spent many an evening with the arm of a perfectly bred witch on his, and not one of them made my son as happy as you do. As his mother, that is what should be most important, is it not? Narcissa looked at her knowingly, and Hermione couldn't suppress a shiver of her spine. Besides, Narcissa continued, that wry smirk returning to her lips, if Draco's father wishes to keep his monthly allowance as it is, he has very little say on the matter. Hermione snorted. She couldn't wait to tell Harry and Ron that Lucius Malfoy had pocket money. Narcissa's words about Draco crept back to the forefront of her mind, all amusement draining from her as quickly as it had risen. Had he really been that happy with her, even though their relationship was for the majority notoriously and painfully one-sided? Hermione frowned, dozens of memory whizzing through her mind as she tried to consider what moments of their relationship was unique to themselves. Evidently, Narcissa had no problem with having a one-sided conversation, Hermione's mind whirring away as she supplied Hermione with endless stories about how the Malfoy family had acquired each of the plants in the conservatory, and even offered Hermione a tour of the Manus potion laboratory the next time she visited their home, to which Hermione eagerly agreed, before blushing at her presumptuousness. She hadn't even spoken to Draco yet, and there she was, already making plans with his mother. Her great-grandmother Ida truly would be rolling in her grave. Hermione finished her tea, not even bothering to attempt to copy Narcissa's delicate grip of the china. Her knees still throbbed from being clipped against the table leg, and thanked Narcissa for the impromptu, graceful hosting some 40 minutes later. The conservatory glowed warmly under the light of the sunset. Narcissa nodded graciously. It was my pleasure, Miss Granger. Please do call me Hermione, she insisted again, as she carefully got up from her seat. Very well, Hermione. Is there anything else I can do for you? Hermione bit her lip, her mind having settled on what to do some minutes earlier, and the words that she never thought she would ever say fell from her lips. May I ask your house elf for a favor? Thank you for listening to today's chapter of Once More with Feelin by Wetpretzel, read by Alex Marbella. If you would like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on AO3, YouTube, or Tumblr. Thank you to Wetpretzel for letting me read their story, and thank you to all of you for listening.